AI may not be your responsibility. It might belong to IT, it might belong to human resources, it might belong to the leadership team, whatever it may be, but its impacts are very much your responsibility. And if you do not pay attention to it, you could find yourself on the wrong side of some of these sources of psychological debt. Some of the biggest barriers to AI adoption are the things that people don't necessarily talk about. These things are particularly important. They are a real concern for employees, and they're having a sizable impact, negative impact, on how AI is generating value for organizations.
That was Dr Guy Champniss, our guest today. I'm James Woodman, and this is the Speak to the Human podcast. If you don't recognise my voice, that's because I'm new here. Sarah Abramson hosted 23 episodes, and she built something really special. Now I'm in the chair and continuing what she started. Although I'm not completely new, I was Sarah's very first guest in episode 1, and the subject of curiosity came up a lot in that interview. Our shared interest in being professionally curious about people and organisations, how people behave, why they do the things they do, figuring out how to use that understanding to make a positive difference. And right now, I think that's what a lot of organisations need when it comes to AI. They want adoption, effective use, risk management, and many of them see that as a technology challenge, so they make it all about the tools, the systems, the IT. But the real impact comes from how people use AI every day. So that gives us our question for this episode. If you want people to use AI at work and to use it well, what are the human factors that make a difference? That's a big topic. We can't cover everything today, but Guy Champniss is here to give us a way in. He's a social psychologist who applies behavioural science to how organisations and the people in them innovate and change. Later we'll get on to how he's bringing that thinking to AI adoption, but first, Guy, why does this question matter? We hear about a lot of organisations treating AI mainly as a technology or IT challenge. What happens when they do that?
I think the major challenge there, of course, is it's a very narrow and it's a very convenient lens through which to look at the challenge, to look at what you're trying to do. And it's so narrow, it's incorrect. I mean, if you think about any successful technology company, it is essentially successful because it's a behavior change company. So the very obvious examples, the Amazons, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, the Netflixes of this world, yes, they are positioned as technology companies, but the reason they succeed what drives their success is they've understood the importance of using their technology to change consumer behavior. If no one used their technology, this brilliant technology would just sit there doing nothing. I think there's a really interesting sort of parallel. It's absolutely stating the obvious, but also at the same time, it's quite profound. One of the previous US Surgeons General, C. Everett Koop, made the point of saying, drugs, even the best ones, don't work in people that don't take them. And I think that's what we're seeing currently with AI, or that's beginning to emerge with AI. That no matter how good these tools are, if you don't think about what drives our human motivation to use those tools, you're sort of just tossing a coin. You're just throwing darts at a dartboard in terms of whether these things are going to work. Because when you look at human behavior, simply giving someone something that works is very rarely sufficient to get them to use it.
You bring in a new piece of technology, the people who own that technology and implement it and launch it and roll it out are the IT department. It's about technology. So they're the ones who are deciding how this gets adopted. They're the ones who are trying to make it a success. But there are consequences from thinking about it through a technology lens, aren't there?
Yes, and I would say that I would say that actually AI is this is an organizational change, business transformation challenge. It's not a technology challenge. If you think through the complexities, the nuances around what drives behavior in the workplace, in any way, it is really, I mean, I would say, it's naive to think that actually simply plonking this technology in front of someone um, is going to be enough to have people realize, okay, fine, I'm not going to use this. You can mandate it. You can basically coerce people into using it, and that happens a lot in organizations as various things. You can turn old things off, and that leads to people having to use the new stuff. But I think what we're seeing with AI is its potential is not just in that binary use it, don't use it. It's in how you use it, and so. Again, it really requires that far more careful, nuanced understanding of what are my motivations to use it. Crucially, what are my motivations to avoid it? What are my motivations to use it in certain situations? All of these things are important. And honestly, IT, technology departments, are not well equipped to focus on those aspects.
Really interesting, and we're going to come back to those aspects of AI adoption. I want to stick with what you were saying. You were talking about motivation, but I want to ask you about your motivation to think about this from the point of view of people and what they are doing with the technology. You're making a case for approaching this in that way. What interests you about that? Why do you think in this way? What's brought you to the point of believing this is the right approach?
So I started off my sort of posting an MBA. I was involved in sort of insights work for a large agency group, and I just felt the quality of those insights was not as good as it could be, in the sense that we were sort of very focused on. Sometimes we were prioritizing certain measures that were cleaner and they presented better in front of clients over what was actually probably closer to the truth of why things were happening. That led me to go do my PhD because I thought, actually, I want to be part of the solution here. So I have a fundamental interest in, I suppose, the messiness of human behavior and trying to sort of untangle that messiness to sort of understand, well, where's the signal just here as opposed to the noise, which, by the way, I think is absolutely possible. So that drives me. But also, I do think you can reduce, if that's the right word, you can distill most business challenges to a behavioral challenge. That businesses are essentially the people in them. And anything you're trying to do with the business, whether that's pivot, enter a new market, introduce a new product, culture change, whatever it may be, at some point you bump up against the people in the organization, and they are the ones, consciously or subconsciously, that decide whether these things work or not. So I am definitely biased, but I would take the position of saying every business challenge, every business opportunity requires you to understand about behavior, because at some point you want to change someone's behavior, whether it's employees, stakeholders, customers, consumers, regulators, whatever it may be. So for me, I feel it's a fundamental truth around sort of business success is you have to understand business. You have to understand behavior.
I have always felt that so strongly, this sense when people talk about businesses doing things or organizations deciding things or whatever it is, that is not true. Businesses can't do things. The people in them do things. In the organizations, people decide things and choose things. And then from outside, there might be a perception that the business has done it. But it's all about people. So now you're taking all this interest and experience in human behavior and you're applying it to AI. You've just published a piece of research which is all about unlocking high quality AI adoption at work. Tell us what question you set out to answer. What were you hoping to achieve with that?
So the main question was to address the human aspect of AI, because, as you were mentioning earlier on, the conversation is dominated by the technology, and it's dominated by the models. It's dominated by their performance, and the conversation itself is dominated by the companies that make them. And we wanted to look with this piece of research at how much the human aspects, the human AI relationship, was contributing to healthy, high quality adoption. And we felt that part was missing in the conversation to this point. It's popping up in certain places in a sort of sporadic fashion, but what we wanted to do is create a more sort of coherent, consistent framework to say, this is the other bit of the AI equation that most organizations are not looking at, and this is why it matters.
So give us the headlines from the research, particularly what surprised you in what you found.
Well, a couple of things surprised us. Firstly, we found, based on our measures, that only about 2 in 5 employees that we spoke to is in a particularly good place with AI at work. 40%. Okay, so the minority of employees we spoke to are in a particularly good position. The other thing that was very interesting was that actually some of the biggest barriers to AI adoption are the things that people don't necessarily talk about. And those are things around the erosion or the attack on your professional identity at work, and also the attack on what it means to be part of a community at work, these social aspects. There's some chat, there's some commentary, there's some research that looks at some of the cognitive consequences of AI. That's quite well publicized. There's been nothing to date really about the social consequences of AI at work. And we saw that these things are particularly important. They are a real concern for employees, and they're having a sizable impact, negative impact, on how AI is generating value for organizations.
And we're going to come back to those things in more detail, and also how people might respond both at an organizational level and also individually. It would be helpful if you could explain how you measured this, because you split this adoption quality into 4 components. I know 2 of them are about what happens more at the organizational level, 2 are a bit more personal and individual. I think those personal ones are particularly relevant to what we're talking about today in terms of individual human behaviors. So talk us through all 4, but particularly focus on the individual level ones, please.
Sure. So the 2 that are less interesting to our conversation, but we felt were an important part of measuring this sort of whole idea of AI adoption quality. One is what we call the means. So in other words, do people have the skills to use AI? Have they been trained? Do they have the knowledge and the understanding and the expertise? There's a second one we call machinery, and that's both soft and hard. So the hard machinery is, are the tools deployed and easily accessible within the business? And the soft machinery is things like the culture and the leadership of the organization. How much do they endorse and encourage the use of these tools? The 2 that are probably more interesting for us, though, they sit more at the sort of the personal, or I should say the psychological level. One is what we call relevance, AI relevance. And that describes how much you think that AI makes a difference to you and your company, your role, and the sector you work in. That's an interesting one because it sort of mirrors something in health psychology, where we know that one of the major drivers of someone taking medication is their thoughts about what's the likelihood of me catching the disease and what happens if I catch it. How severe will it be? I think there are some clear parallels with AI. People that think it's not really relevant to me, doesn't really impact me if I don't use it, that means for them they have a very low AI relevance score, and we think that takes away their motivation to engage with it. The 4th one is what we call readiness. So there's relevance in terms of how much you think is important. Readiness describes really how ready are you to accept it? Where are you psychologically with the technology? This is a really complicated area, one that's not really talked about in the literature more broadly, but there are lots of psychological impacts of using AI, particularly in an unstructured way. And we wanted to sort of bundle those up in a sort of coherent framework for organizations to be able to look at this and say, well, actually, are we measuring these things? And if we're not, we probably should be, because this gives us a really clear understanding of just how willing and motivated our employees are going to be to use the technology. And ultimately, every business does need that. They need their employees to embrace it, to experiment with it, and to use it. And this idea of AI readiness tries to quantify how likely that is to happen in a business.
Tell us about that. Tell us about these psychological barriers, and particularly how they influence what people do or what they might not do, what they might avoid.
Yeah, so in terms of what they may do or not do, so we also measured 3 things. We 3 measures of sort of AI usage that we felt were valuable to businesses. Firstly, we looked at how often do people use AI? Then we looked at what type of tasks do they use it for? And that ranges from very simple email drafting type and sort of grammar checking tasks, all the way through to more sophisticated strategic planning type tasks. So that was our second measure. And the third one, which is sort of inversely related to those two, was how likely are they to avoid using AI, even in situations where they knew it would be useful. So those are three things to bear in mind. Those are the things we're measuring in terms of AI usage. The areas in terms of readiness that we explored ranged from concerns over degradation in your decision-making abilities. This is well documented that actually the more I use it, I get sort of cognitively lazy. I don't engage with the material so much. I don't own the answers as well. I don't interrogate it in some ways. So that's something called cognitive, what we called it was called cognitive debt. But some of the others relate to things like, for example, losses of autonomy. In other words, I feel like I'm losing control over my work. A loss of competency or mastery. And that describes the fact the more I use AI, the worse I feel about what I do in terms of I'm just not as skilled as I thought I was. AI can now do something in 30 seconds it was taking a day to do. So what does that tell me about my skill levels in my job? There's relatedness. This describes our desire to be part of a social group, and that actually there's good evidence to show that AI is taking that away from us, that actually the more you interact with AI, the less likely it is that you'll spend time with coworkers, both formally or informally. And that has huge implications for collaboration, for example. There's credibility, a loss of credibility. Again, there's research that shows that if you announce to your peers that you're using AI, they think less of you, by and large. Interestingly, even if they're also using it, they don't think less of themselves, but they think less of you for using it. And then the last one we looked at was what we call professional social identity. In other words, does the specific use of AI, does it dent or damage what it means to you to be doing the job that you do? In other words, are there certain behaviors, certain characteristics that are important to you because they define what it means to be head of accounting, a senior marketeer, whatever it may be? Are there aspects of using AI that damage what it means to be that type of person? And we looked at all those six, to sort of understand how much resistance, how much negative impact are these things having on employees. Because if AI is mandated, if AI is pushed through as a technology-first solution, these negative consequences will accrue and will have an impact at some point. They'll grow very silently, but at some point, something will come to the surface. We badged it all under the term of what we called psychological debt. And our concerns are that businesses are accruing this psychological debt by not looking specifically at these particular aspects of the human AI relationship.
It's interesting, when you mentioned credibility, you said that people think less of their peers, their colleagues, if their colleagues are open about the fact that they're using AI, but they don't think less of themselves. So I think it's okay for me to use AI, but it's not so okay for the people around me to use it. But I think it also sounds as though actually I probably do think less of myself. I might not admit that to anyone else, but I think what you're saying in these factors is it diminishes me in some way. I feel that personally.
So that can definitely happen. So, for example, yes, if you may feel that your competency, your mastery is dropping as a result. So yes, that can happen. The credibility piece, though, is looking at whether or not you as an individual feel negatively impacted, your perceptions of other people. And those perceptions are that actually I think less of you. There will be caveats around that, of course. But the research says that actually, we think less of other people. We think they're maybe cheating, that they're becoming lazy, they're taking shortcuts. None of these are qualities which add to your credibility in the workplace. It is probably important to say that, these six aspects of what we call psychological debt, we're not saying that they're all distinct, that they could feed into each other in some way. So probably a better way to look at them, I think, is to say, well, there's six different doors that may be open onto the same room. And actually for certain organizations, going through one door rather than another might be a slightly clearer way to think about, well, what do we need to do within the organization to make sure that we're not causing these negative consequences to sort of build up with our teams.
And to focus in on this, the identity strand, so that feeling that your professional identity is being threatened. I think you said that people can feel uncomfortable talking about that this is not something that people open up about. But also, you found that it's potentially the main reason that we avoid using AI.
Yes. So why may people not talk about it? It might be that it's just a relatively alien concept. I think this idea of social identities in the workplace it's a bit messy, it's a bit complicated, so it doesn't get talked about as broadly as it probably should, mainly because as the science tells us, we switch from one identity to another quite often, which means that we may appear very inconsistent in our behaviors. And I think most research would like to show consistency of some sort. So it's a bit of an inconvenient truth around how we operate as social creatures. So yes, maybe that explains why people don't talk about it as much. I think it's probably quite personal. It's quite difficult to talk about, but actually, it feels quite profound at an individual level. I mean, interestingly, in our research, the cohort that expressed it as a negative the most were consulting and professional services employees. And that sort of mirrors some of the sort of the general chatter you see in the press around the big consulting firms and the sort of the existential threat that AI is creating for them, to a certain extent with lawyers as well. But yes, you're right. What was very interesting is even though they talked about it very little, or they acknowledged it very little, when we look at the variations in that level of acknowledgement, we see the greatest variations in those AI behaviors we're measuring. In other words, small movements in the sense that it's attacking my social identity correspond to the largest movements in terms of people using AI less, people using it for more basic tasks, and for people avoiding using it. So yes, I think in that respect, it's maybe more under the surface, but it seems to have a disproportional, outsized influence on some of those key behaviors that every organization is keen to grow and establish within their teams.
You've got a specific example of how that can play out with people who are experts when you give them AI, haven't you?
Yes. So I think it offers a plausible explanation for this. Ironically, we were contacted by one of the large technology businesses that is one of the main architects of AI, of Gen AI, and behind all the sort of hoopla and the headlines around how successful it was, they acknowledged that actually they had a problem internally getting certain individuals to actually use the very technology they designed, and those individuals were the senior software engineers. They didn't want to use the very thing they built. And the question was around, is it a problem with the training programs? Is the product itself not very good? And our view was, well, that's unlikely. We think what's more likely is you're asking them to use a technology, you're asking them to engage in a specific behavior which damages their social identity. And what I mean by that is that these senior engineers have spent potentially decades building a level of expertise, a level of sort of nuanced, tacit understanding of how to do these things. And suddenly you're putting in front of them what their own company says is a highly democratizing technology. That's fine for people that don't have those skills. But for these individuals, it was a direct attack on what it meant to have that role in the organization. And that could well have been driving their resistance to use the tech. This was completely new to the company. They said, we had just assumed, going back to your first point, we'd assume this is a problem with training or technology, not with psychology.
Okay, so what can we do about this? I bet there are people listening who are thinking this. I mean, specifically this point about people feeling their professional identity is being threatened, that they're being diminished in some way by the arrival of AI and by people using it. What can they do about that? If they feel that this is a problem for people in their organisation, how do you suggest they respond?
So for the identity piece, I think to caveat all of this, I think it's very, very dependent on the specific situation. But if we had to pick a couple of sort of general approaches to this, I think the first thing to think about is you need to reframe the use of that technology, not as an identity damaging behavior, but as an identity enhancing behavior. And that sounds like semantics, but I think, as is the case with all communications and framing, yes, that's what it comes down to. So, for example, clinicians are one of the groups that have basically pushed back historically the most about using AI in terms of diagnosis, therapy choices, etc. Phillips has done a very interesting job there of basically trying to position the use of AI as taking away some of those more rudimentary, lower order tasks for clinicians, which allows them to exercise their expertise and their judgment, give them more room to do that, and also to spend more time focusing on caring for the patient, the patient interaction. So that's an example there where actually, you are converting what's initially seen as an identity challenging, identity damaging behavior around using technology to being one that actually is being seen to endorse or increase the distinctiveness of what it means to be an oncologist, for example. So that's the first thing to think about, I think, is, can you be a little bit more careful around how you frame the use of the technology? Can you identify some of those specific behaviors that are really the behaviors that really signal what it means to be a specialist in that group, and make sure that the use of technology is not damaging those? It, to a certain extent, is a little bit of common sense just there. A second one is around building social norms. So the more you can get key individuals within those social groups, so other oncologists in the case of the sort of medical example, or whatever other social group it is, the more you can get those individuals to talk about and share their experiences of using the technology, again, the less it becomes a technology or a behavior that is damaging the group, and more it becomes a behavior that is actually supporting the group. And the third one, very practically, is there are lots of very specific use cases for AI at specific moments in sort of workflows. Some of those moments are going to have an outsized impact on what it means to be a professional in that environment. If that's the case, move it to somewhere else. Try and slide the moments when you use the technology away from what those very sort of high profile, high impact moments. That can also help reduce the sense that actually this is damaging what it means to me to be a prominent, successful, aspirational member of this social group.
Can you give me a quick example of that sense of sliding the moments from one place to another? What would that look like?
Well, so the obvious one is when you take something from being very public to being private. So even though we know in these sort of social identities that actually private behaviors also do still impact on what it means to be a member of the group, it certainly diminishes it to a certain extent. So rather than having something happening in front of peers, for example, you can take it away and have it happen privately. So in other words, you sort of slide that particular behavior, that moment using the technology. But it can also work the other way, in the sense of actually you could protect social identity by sliding what is a private or an individual exchange of the technology to being a group exchange. Because by doing it in a group environment, you're actually creating, say, for example, you are assessing the quality of the outputs of an AI exchange. If you do that with your peers, actually what it does is it creates an opportunity for you to demonstrate your particular expertise. You might be specialists in one area and one of your peers in something else. That's a great identity building behavior rather than a damaging one, because suddenly you've now got a new opportunity. Social identities work in the sense that the identity is particularly strong when I've got more opportunities to demonstrate I'm a member of this group. And so that sort of collective decision making, that collective review process. So that's an example of taking it from private to public. That could be a good opportunity to say, actually, by doing this, you're strengthening a membership of the group. So again, I think it really varies from case to case, but a lot of this is not particularly complicated or sophisticated, but it does need to be looked at and can yield, as I say, outsized benefits through these very small sort of interventions.
That is such an interesting point, because I think what you're talking about is switching Gen AI use from being something that is effectively solitary, and it's like having an invisible colleague who you collaborate with on a piece of work, making it something that you do as part of a team of other human beings, that feels really powerful. Organisations could choose to do things there, leaders could choose to do things there, which can happen across a business, across an organisation, but that would make a genuine difference to individuals through seeing them happen and being part of it.
I think so. I think it would switch off a lot of those sort of destructive motivations around using it, but also it could create opportunities for stronger teamwork, to build more effective teams, to increase collaboration. So I think actually, you could have some very positive spillover effects as a result of saying, right, okay, we're now using AI for these tasks. We're going to try and build in these sort of collective reviews of what we're doing. I think there are some good examples of the likes of Coca-Cola and P&G doing this, certainly around innovation, but of course it doesn't need to be constrained to those particular sort of sectors. I think any organisation of any size could do it.
And it makes it visible too, doesn't it? It means I can see other people doing this. I can see my boss doing this. I can see the leaders talking about this. And maybe that makes it more okay. It also maybe makes it more likely that if something isn't going okay, if there's something uncomfortable about the way we're using AI, or there are risks that people haven't picked up on, perhaps we're more likely to spot them if we do it openly together like that.
Yes, I think that's a good example of where those 6 different sources of what we call psychological debt, that sort of action could disable or suddenly reduce lots of them at the same time. Your sense of autonomy would be protected. That sense of relatedness, of being part of a working team, would be bolstered. Your own credibility could be demonstrated. Your sense of social identity would be supported. So yes, you could see lots of knock-on effects of doing something like that, which would be beneficial, in lots of ways.
It strikes me that going back to the top level of the research, so the 4 components you were measuring, the means, the machinery, the relevance and the readiness scores, although they are separated, and I understand why, but they are also connected in that if the means, if I don't feel I have the skills or I don't feel confident using AI, I probably don't feel psychologically ready. If within the machinery, which includes culture and the way leaders talk about this and the position within the organisation, if that is not right for me, again, I'm not going to feel ready. I might not feel that it's relevant. If this isn't relevant to what we do here, then it's not relevant to me. So they're separate, but also they do overlap in the same way that the 6 different barriers you talked about overlap within the readiness. The components of the overall adoption quality sit together too, don't they?
Yes, and I think that's a benefit of it, in the sense that those 4 areas, as those headlined, and then the sort of specific bits within those 4 areas, in a way, to a certain extent, they are different ways to ask the same question. And I think by asking that question differently, you may be looking at the same thing, but you see it from a different angle. You might see something that's behind it that you can't see from another angle. So I do think it gives a more sort of nuanced, but ultimately quite a holistic view. And again, I think that the important bit there is around this idea of what does the human infrastructure need to look like within the organization? What does the human AI relationship need to be? And to answer that question, you can't really answer it with one question. You sort of need to ask it in a variety of ways. And I think that's what we're trying to do there. Each of those 4 areas, it's like taking a couple of steps to your right and looking again, and then a couple of steps again and looking again, etc.
That sounds like the perspective of somebody who's spent their career figuring stuff like this out and finding out how to understand it better.
I think the answer there, yeah, there's no silver bullet, but there can be silver buckshot, and the buckshot comes from walking all the way around it, I think, yeah.
So we started this conversation by asking what are the human factors that make a difference to AI adoption, and I should say that your report goes much, much deeper than this conversation possibly can in the time that we've got. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes for this episode. But I think if I asked you to simplify all of this, really boil it down as much as you can, what is the most important thing you want people to take away from this conversation?
Well, I would say do not see AI adoption as a technology challenge to be solved. See it increasingly as a human challenge to be solved, and whatever that means for how the organization approaches it. And I would also say that be more sophisticated, be more intelligent about trying to understand where those barriers to adoption come from. We've seen from our research that some of the things that people talk about the least potentially matter the most. And we need to get far better at measuring those things and compensating for them, because there are real concerns, or there are real consequences, I should say, of not doing these things. Not only does it lead to potentially very unhappy, very stressed, potentially very alienated employees if all this psychological debt accrues, but also it'll impact organizations because the organization will become more brittle, collaboration will start to fall away, training budgets will get ever larger and become less effective. And there's also a much bigger sort of macroeconomic piece that actually all these AI companies they're relying on revenues coming in from licenses for all of this. Those licenses will only be awarded if the value of AI becomes clearer. So again, all of those factors distill all the way down to behavior. And we have to be more focused on driving that behavior.
Are there simple signals, warning signs, things that somebody could pay attention to where they work, where you would expect if these things are problems or becoming more of a problem, you could recognize that?
Yes, I think there are two ways you can spot these. You can either ask people directly, which is what we did in our research, and that does stand as a sort of, company-wide survey tool. But you can also spot certain behaviors, yes. So for example, you might see collaboration dropping. You might also see people engaging sort of workaround behaviors. So in other words, are they trying to slightly reshape their own job descriptions to avoid those aspects of their job where the use of AI is in some way accruing psychological debt? Maybe it really impacts what it means for them from a social identity point of view. Maybe it really undermines their sense of autonomy. Are they increasingly looking to sort of work with people in other parts of the organization to try and break free of those things? So I think there are quite a few ways you could try and spot those.
From all of this point about paying attention to what's happening with AI and understanding how people are responding, what is your number one piece of advice to someone listening to this?
So my number one piece of advice is that AI may not be your responsibility. It might belong to IT, it might belong to human resources, it might belong to the leadership team, whatever it may be, but its impacts are very much your responsibility. And if you do not pay attention to it, you could find yourself on the wrong side of some of these sources of psychological debt. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters for the organization in terms of productivity and performance, etc. But probably more importantly, it matters to you, because we know that if these sources of psychological debt increase, you will become less happy, you'll become less motivated, you will feel more coerced into your role, you will lose your sense of connectedness with your peers. These are all things that have predated AI in terms of we know these are really important drivers of what it means to be happy and productive in a role. If you don't pay attention to these things, AI could take those things away from you. So it is incredibly important to be mindful of, to be open to, but also critical of how you interact with AI in your role.
If someone's listening to this and they are finding AI adoption at work difficult personally, so not as a leader, not whatever their role is, but just as an individual at work, what would you say to them? What would you say about responding to this sense of worry or resisting technology or losing their professional identity?
So I think I would say where most of us are in the same position is the truth. Again, because the story is owned by, the narrative is owned by the technology companies, it is presented as this bright, shiny future that everyone else except for you and me are currently in. The reality is, I think everyone is in that same position. There is very little real knowledge around the impacts just here. So the first thing I'd say is not to panic, I think. I would say it's very important to critically engage with the technology. That means understanding it a little bit. I think it's important for us to dispel this sort of technology as magic perception that is very prevalent. Understand a little bit how it works, because actually then it becomes far more mechanical and actually bizarrely extremely inefficient for what it does, and that can make us feel better. And then also in effect, do a little bit of an audit to say, well, actually, how can this be useful for me in what I do? It cannot be something which takes away your decision-making skills. It cannot be something which chips away what it means for you to be in your role. And that is largely, I think, within your gift, within all of our gifts, to sort of say, well, actually, look at this. How can I make AI work for me? How can it make my work better? I think there is a positive answer to that question for everyone, but it starts with needing to engage critically with the technology and to not panic that we all think we're the only ones not to have yet worked that out.
I think that's really helpful. And I think for me, certainly having felt personally that sense of being threatened by this, that kind of professional identity loss or risk of that, I think it's interesting because we've talked quite a bit about how to reduce that sense, how an organisation might change the way they work or change what they do to help people feel more ready, like AI is more relevant, like the psychological barriers aren't there so much. But I do feel also those feelings tell us something important. If you feel that if you feel a sense that you are using AI yourself in ways that threaten what you do professionally, in ways that reduce your credibility, in ways that have social consequences in the team that you work in, it feels to me that it's important to pay attention to that, not just to push through it and say, well, my employer wants me to use AI and to embrace this technology, but to say, actually, the fact I feel that, it's important and we should be talking about that and having a culture where we can be open and where other people talk about it, we respond positively. That feels like the way that you ensure that people are in charge of the technology, that the technology isn't taking the lead, that we continue to keep control. That is something I want to find out more about, how people are responding to that, how people do it. And it's going to be the focus for another of these podcasts soon. Guy, it has been brilliant speaking to you. Thank you. Thank you for doing the research. Thank you for sharing the results, and thank you for giving us your time and insights today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I think, yes, we're at an inflection point. I think, as the technology to a certain extent stabilizes and matures, I think it's inevitable and important that the conversation the attention swings towards how does this work for us, and how can we make sure that actually that human AI relationship within organizations is healthy and productive. And I think that conversation is just getting started.
If you want to dig deeper, Guy's full report is on his website. We'll put the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Speak to the Human. I'm James Woodman. And if you've got a question you'd like Actian to explore in a future episode about AI or behaviour change or anything to do with the human experience of work, please get in touch. hello@actiancommunication.com. See you next time.